Welcome once again to the 16th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. The summit this year is being held in conjunction with International Compost Awareness Week, one of the largest educational and outreach initiatives of the composting industry. The theme this year is Recipe for Regeneration Compost. I'd love to thank all of our fabulous sponsors who enable us to put this program on free of cost to all of our participants. Without their support, we really wouldn't be able to pull that off. So thank you so much to Community Bank, Eco Products, Vegware, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, Vermont Natural Ag Products, AgriLab Technologies, Compost Manufacturing Alliance, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program of the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and Wasted, Separating Waste, Connecting Communities. I'd like to invite Paul Hansen to unmute and if you'd like, share your video and share a little bit about your business with us.
Thank you, Natasha. Good afternoon. EcoPixel is so happy to be supporting VORS again this year. We create websites that help with solid waste management districts, towns, conservation nonprofits, and other organizations to better serve their communities. I'm looking forward to this particular session about behavioral science because at EcoPixel, a lot of our work is in the related field of user experience or UX. While we do a lot of website design and development, our UX work is what makes these websites successful. UX or user experience is the research, testing, and analysis that goes into making a website suit the needs and goals of its audiences. It's what makes a website truly effective. At EcoPixel, we also focus on designing websites that are inclusive and accessible to people with disabilities. It's ultimately about making the website easier to use by everyone. And the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to websites, all websites, and requires them to be accessible, but unfortunately, a lot of websites fall short on that. So we're here to help with that big problem. If your organization needs help creating an effective, inclusive website, we would love to talk with you. Natasha already mentioned the silent auction. I wanted to invite you to bid on our online auction item. It's a 1-hour web accessibility and design consultation, during which we'll provide actionable steps that you can take to improve your existing website. It's a great deal and it supports the Composting Association of Vermont. So thanks a lot and look forward to this session, and I'll turn this back to our presenters.
So on to today's program. We are at the 1 p.m. session, Beyond Awareness, Sparking Behavior Change with Behavioral Science. And we're super lucky to have Action Research with us today to share their experience in changing behavior for the public good by applying marketing and social science research to outreach programs. Jennifer and Lori are both here. We had a great conversation this morning that started our dialogue around source separation of organics and the behavioral and sort of human piece of making this a reality on the ground. So we're sort of continuing that conversation now, looking more into the behavioral science. I would just like to invite anyone, as you have questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat anytime you think of them. We're going to be taking just sort of clarifying questions as Jennifer goes through the presentation, but there'll be plenty of time for deeper questions and dialogue and conversation after the presentation. So Jennifer, please take it away.
All right, thank you. You should be able to see my screen, and apologize for any background noise. It appears that our office building today, they're doing some work on the roof, so there's these loud bangs all of a sudden. So if you hear something like that, it is not an earthquake. We do get them out here, but not very often. So apologize in advance for that.
No worries.
So yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jennifer Tabanico, and before I introduce Lori, I just kind of talk to you briefly about how I fell into this work. So here's a picture of me at probably about 5 or 6 years old. I grew up in Arizona in the Phoenix area, And one of the things that I really loved to do was go to the zoo. We went to the Phoenix Zoo all the time. And of course, I liked the petting zoo and the animals like most 5-year-olds. But what I really liked to do was look into the trash cans to see what other people were throwing away. So my interest in waste and human behavior goes way back. If I couldn't look into those trash cans, then I would throw these embarrassing, obnoxious tantrums until I was escorted back and allowed to look in. So I also learned to change behavior, at least on the part of my parents, at a very early age. Fortunately, I found better ways to go about behavior change than throwing tantrums, and went on to study psychology both as an undergraduate and then got my master's degree in experimental psychology. And during my master's program, I had the first opportunity to work on a real world problem. So I got to apply psychology to 2 efforts across the state of California through grants that were being funded by our Waste Management Board, which is now Cal Recycle. And we had 2 statewide grants, one focused on used oil recycling and the other on waste tires. And so through that work, I saw 2 things. Number one, behavior can change. So using the process that I'm going to talk to you about today, we learned that we can actually move people to change their behavior without tantrums. But I also learned that behavioral and social science was a huge and essential part of helping that behavior change to happen. So that interest really was sparked by my work at the university and led to the development of action research. So we are dedicated, as Natasha mentioned, to applying both marketing and social science research to the development of outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. So everything that we work on is behavior change. We don't sell products, though we may use some of those same techniques. We're really focused on behaviors that benefit environment, health, and public safety. The vast majority of our work has been in the area of environment. And so I've asked Lori to join me today. Lori is our director of research here at Action Research. She's been with me for 15 years, and together we've worked across a wide range of topics. In the beginning, we worked quite a bit on getting people to recycle, and now 15 years later, we're getting people to participate in organics collection here in California and addressing contamination issues. We've also worked across a wide range of other domains, including agriculture, transportation, energy, water quality, human and wildlife issues, and more. So Lori is, if you want to pop on real quick and say hi, Lori is working currently on 4 or 5 different initiatives across the state of California that are trying to increase the collection of organics and participation or decrease contamination, both in residential and commercial contexts. So I've asked Lori to address your questions that you might have in the chat as we go along, but she'll also have a lot of really great insights to add to our question and answer session towards the end.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here.
All right, so the first point I want to make today is, and we heard this in the session this morning, is that behavior matters. So if we look at just any environmental problem, whether it's climate or air quality and certainly waste, we can really drill that down to an individual action. So I like to say that environmental problems are behavior problems, and therefore they require behavior-based solutions. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to approach the issues. So for example, one way to address issues with waste has been through technology and infrastructure. So we create compostable products, for example, or we put in infrastructure for collection of different types of waste, separate collection of compost, for example. Well, these are great and essential parts of solving the problem, but they still have a behavior component. So if there are new compostable products, but people don't want to use them, then because they're used to the alternatives that they have, then we're not really getting where we hope to. Or if they're putting those products into the wrong bins, we're not really getting to the outcomes we hope for. Similarly, with infrastructure, if people don't interact and engage with that infrastructure the way it's intended, whether it's a public collection system or a curbside collection system, we're ultimately not going to achieve the outcomes that are intended. So human behavior has a role even when there are technology and infrastructure solutions. Human behavior is also a factor when it comes to policy and law. I heard this morning, there are policies in place, but we can't always wait for policy. So I know, Vermont has policy, like California, we've got policy here now too, but a lot of places don't. And so while we're waiting for those policies to get in place, we need people to engage in those behaviors on a voluntary basis. So it can buy us some time. And additionally, when you get people engaged for voluntary reasons, it increases the likelihood that they're going to be supportive of those policies down the road. So we're really focused on encouraging voluntary actions that support technology and infrastructure, that support policy, and also decrease the need for enforcement and of regulations. But not only does behavior matter, as it turns out, the behavior matters. So even just within composting, there are a wide range of different behaviors that could be targeted. So there's, for example, participation in curbside collection, and that might look different depending on where you are, or if it's a community composting program, or if we're asking people to separate certain things out of the organic stream. There's a number of different behaviors that could potentially be targeted. And each of these has different barriers associated with them. So what might prevent someone from putting their food in a yard waste cart and rolling that out to the curb is actually different than what might prevent people from just putting food waste in a smaller food waste only cart and rolling that out to the curb, which is different still than what might prevent someone from composting on their own property. So we really need to be thinking about composting as this collection of lots of different behaviors that need to be understood. So I'm going to step back here for a minute and talk about how behavior change in the environmental domain in particular has traditionally been approached. And that's been through two paths. First is a knowledge-based approach, and second is an awareness-based approach. And this really represents the vast majority of what we see when we look at programs to promote environmental behaviors. And composting is no exception to that. So the knowledge-based approach assumes that if people don't act because they don't know what to do, or they don't know that they should. So we pummel them with information, we create websites and fact sheets and hold workshops and just push out information with the hope that if people just knew what to do, or if they just knew that this is something they should do, they would jump on board and they would do it. But what we know from a large body of research is that simply having knowledge about how to do something is not sufficient to motivate behavior change. And I heard that mentioned this morning as well. The second approach that underlies a lot of what we see is more of an awareness-based model. So this is based on the idea that people just don't know how important it is. So if we can just get them to care more and see the severity of the problem, they will certainly change. And again, the research is pretty clear in showing that simply having a positive attitude toward something or knowing about its severity is not enough to motivate behavior change in a lot of places. And at times it can be counterproductive where people don't feel that they could impact the problem. So I'm going to show you two examples of where this has been tested, because we have kind of heard it said, well, knowledge isn't enough. And I know that probably comes from lots and lots of experience out there. But this has actually been tested. And one of the most famous tests of the relationship between knowledge and attitudes and behavior change comes from Scott Geller at Virginia Tech. And we present this example because it's actually probably pretty far beyond what most of you could do with the audiences that you're interacting with, in that it was a very highly motivated group, and he spent a lot of time with them, really kind of conveying the message. So what Scott Geller did was conduct a series of energy conservation workshops. And these were about 3-hour workshops designed to educate people about things they could do around their home for low or no costs to improve energy efficiency and to save energy costs. And so they were advertised in the paper, available only to the first 40 people who showed up. So this is going to be 40 pretty motivated people. People still first read the paper and when this study was done, but they're willing to come out on a weekend and spend 3 hours learning about energy conservation. So you have a highly motivated audience. But what Scott did is he wanted to know if attitudes and knowledge changed as a result of going to the workshop, and did behavior change. And what he learned was that after the workshop, people had more positive attitudes about energy conservation and were more knowledgeable about the things that they could do to save energy. So great, they knew more and they cared more. But he also wanted to know, did they do more? And so in the follow-up, he learned that only 1 out of the 40 highly motivated people who attended that workshop lowered the temperature on their hot water heater. And that's a relatively simple action. It's just, in most cases, just turning the dial a notch or two. So only 1 of those 40 people did that. Slightly more encouraging was that 2 out of those 40 people installed a hot water heater wrap. And so that takes a lot more time and effort. But later found out that those 2 individuals had actually installed that hot water heater wrap just before coming to the workshop. So they were sort of already going to do that anyway. The most encouraging finding was that 8 out of the 40 installed a low flow shower head. This is actually really great behavior because it both saved energy due to water heating as well as saved water. But it becomes less impressive when I tell you that all 40 of those individuals had been given a low flow shower head at the workshop. So despite increases in knowledge and awareness and actually having the tools to do the job, there was still low rates of participation. So what we often hear is, well, if we just could reach more people, if we just had a bigger budget and we could just reach more people, then we would be successful. So I pulled one more example here that comes from a national health campaign aimed at motivating people to eat fruits and vegetables. You're probably all very familiar with this campaign. It was a well-funded campaign in the early 90s by the National Cancer Institute. And they were focused on increasing or promoting getting the US public to consume 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And so they did a broad awareness campaign, include billboards and radios and school curriculum and public service announcements, all of that big mass media stuff we're so used to seeing. So in the evaluation of the campaign, in the years prior to the campaign, only about 7% of people knew that they should be eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And in the years following the campaign, that went up to 20%, which is a really substantial increase in knowledge about what they should be doing. And it appears a relatively simple action. They also looked at consumption. In the years prior to the campaign, the reported consumption of fruits and vegetables at the recommended levels, 5 a day, was at 11%. And in the follow-up, that stayed static at 11%. And more recent data shows that it's actually decreased. So even with a big budget and having a very recognizable, memorable campaign, we don't always see behavior change. Now, I can't see a lot of your faces, but I'm guessing a few of you are looking something like this. Because this is what is so commonly done and what we so commonly see. So I'm here to talk about an alternative to traditional information, and that is community-based social marketing. Lori and I have been applying community-based social marketing for well over 15 years, closer to 20 years, across a wide range of topics. And it's broadly applicable to lots and lots of different behaviors. And that is because community-based social marketing is a process and not a tactic. So it is not social media, it's not Facebook, it is actually a data-driven process that draws from the behavioral and social sciences. So community-based social marketing as a term was coined about 30 years ago, and yet it still draws also from decades and decades of research in social psychology, environmental psychology, on a variety of domains of psychological science and social science, sociology, anthropology. So we draw from this rich knowledge about human behavior, culture, and societies, and integrate that into the development of programs. So it's not new, is what I want you to take away from that. Community-based social marketing is also, not surprisingly, community-based. And by that, I mean two things. First, the programs that are developed based on the needs and perceived benefits of the communities in which they're delivered. So it's not a silver bullet approach that works for everyone. We're learning from the community what the needs are and designing programs based on that. The second way it's community-based is that it leverages social influence. And I heard modeling referenced earlier today, and that's one of the tools. So we're leveraging peer influences, modeling, and social diffusion to bring about behavior change. Another hallmark of community-based social marketing is that it's focused on removing barriers. And we'll talk later about what those are specifically, but barriers can be things that are external to the individual that they don't have control over, or things that are internal to the individual, their attitudes, opinions, knowledge, for example. So community-based social marketing is addressing both those internal and external barriers. And then lastly, it is behavior-based. So while we might be interested in knowledge and awareness changes, or we might be interested in engagement, how many people came to the website, how many things did we do, from the very beginning, we're focused on behavior, because ultimately we want to know, did behavior change as a result of the strategies that we deliver? So I find it helpful here to just walk you quickly through the steps, and then I'll show you an example of it in action, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into each of the steps. So community-based social marketing begins with selecting a behavior. And we don't just pick any behavior. This is actually a strategic process to make sure that we're selecting behaviors that are connected to the problem in a meaningful way. Once we have those behaviors identified, we learn about the barriers that decrease the likelihood of engagement in the behavior and the benefits that the audience perceives to engaging in that behavior. And only when we have that information then do we move to that third step, which is developing a strategy, or sometimes a couple of different variations of a strategy. Those strategies are then pilot tested on a small scale for a shorter duration to determine if they are both effective and cost-effective before rolling them out across the broader community. So through this process, we can make sure that our programs are effective before we've used all of our resources, and then find out at the end, oh, nobody's participating. We're able to course correct early on. So just very quickly, I'm going to walk you through a case study. This is one that Lori worked on a few years back, focused on residential curbside recycling in Fort Worth, Texas. And the really interesting thing about this one, at first I'll show you kind of how we made decisions at each step. But one thing that we learned here is that barriers to engaging in recycling are different at the level of individual materials. So not only is it tied to the program, so curbside, for example, versus public collection, but also the actual materials. So the first thing that we needed to do here was to make sure that we had the right behavior. So we knew that we wanted to increase recycling and reduce contamination, but those are very broad. There are many different items that cause contamination and a lot of different items that can be recycled. So what we did is we conducted a study where we looked at people's trash and recycling carts. And specifically, we looked at what are people putting into the trash that should be going into the recycling bin, and what is going into the recycling bin that should be going into the trash. So there we were addressing both recycling and contamination. And the reason that we did that, again, is because we know that barriers vary at the level of individual items. And additionally, if we just give people a really long list of all of the things that they should be doing, our message is going to get lost. So we really wanted to be able to focus in on those items that were most meaningful. And ultimately, we settled on mixed paper. And we learned that mixed paper was in 87% of the trash carts. So it represented a good opportunity for increasing recycling, and was a meaningful amount, 8% of the volume by weight. So focusing just on mixed paper, we learned that the barriers to recycling paper were different than they were for, say, bottles and cans or cardboard. Specifically, when it came to mixed paper, most of that was junk mail. And we learned that people were concerned about putting that junk mail into the trash or into the recycling bin because they had a perception that people were going to be going through it. So they had really significant privacy concerns. Now, perception is reality when it comes to barriers. So we know that when it gets to the recycling facility, people aren't going through the mail and writing down addresses, but that was their perception. So it was something that we needed to address in the program. And there was also another barrier was confusion about certain types of paper, so specifically shiny paper or envelopes with plastic windows. We also heard that in terms of benefits, people felt that it was doing something to protect the environment and they felt it was the right thing to do. Knowing that made it really easy to develop strategies because we could speak directly to the needs of the community. So a couple of different things that were included. The outreach consisted of a hang tag that went onto the recycling cart that included a black marker. And that black marker was intended for them to be able to mark out their private information before putting it into the recycling bin. So that was specifically addressing that privacy concern. But we also educated them that this material was safe in the recycling, as safe as in the trash. We also highlighted some of our survey findings where we found that most people believed recycling was important. So we're leveraging social norms. That's another community-based component. We addressed the confusion with information. So letting people know that all types of paper could go into their recycling bin, including junk mail or envelopes with windows, magazines, and so on. So I won't go into the depths of how we pilot tested this because it's pretty complex, but what I wanted you to see from this is how we're using information to make data-driven decisions at each step and how clear it becomes to develop a strategy. So I'm going to dive deeper now into each of the steps. So I mentioned selecting a behavior is a strategic process. And for some of the behaviors that we work on or some of the domains that we work in, there are literally hundreds of behaviors that we could potentially target. And we see these messages all the time. So 100 things you can do to protect water quality. And when people get that, they are simply overwhelmed with choices. They get this sort of choice overload and likely just disregard the message and do nothing, or they'll pick the things on the list that are maybe pretty easy, but not as impactful. So when we have a larger number of behaviors that could potentially be targeted, we really want to make sure that we're using data to make good decisions about what to target. So I won't go too in depth, but essentially it begins with defining the outcome. So are you focused, for example, on increasing participation or decreasing contamination? So which of those ultimately are going to get you to the final product that you need? And it may be both, right? But it may be that you're focusing on one or the other. The second thing we do is identify the sectors or targets that are most connected to the problem. So for example, if you don't have a large multifamily population and they're not really contributing that much into the waste stream, you may be focusing more on single family residential, or if you've got a big commercial sector, you may be focusing there first. Understanding that the needs are going to be different in each of these sectors. And then within those sectors, we then define the target behaviors. What specifically are you asking people to do? So it's not just participate in the organics collection program, but what does that look like? What are the actions that they're going to need to take? When there are multiple actions, we then go into efforts to prioritize those behaviors. And those are prioritized based on consideration of how much impact they would have on the outcome, how much people are doing it already. So we want to find behaviors where there's some room to move. If everybody's already doing the right thing, then it's kind of diminished returns. We also look at the likelihood that we can get people to engage in the behavior and then the relevance of that behavior across the target population. So we're considering different factors as we decide which behaviors to focus on. So in California and across the globe, we know that organics and food waste scraps and organics more broadly are significant components of the waste stream. So we already know this is a big problem. So that's good. And then, but then within those chunks, what are all of the different behaviors that could potentially be targeted? So some of it is participation in collection. But some of it is source reduction. So I know Lori is working on some programs right now aimed at food waste reduction. So let's just reduce it at the source, and then which reduces how much is going to have to be collected. In defining behaviors, we're considering a couple of different things. First, we want to make sure that the behaviors are non-divisible. So basically, this means they can't be divided down into further actions. So recycle or even compost can be divided into much smaller actions. And each of those have their own barriers associated with them. End state is the final behavior that they have to do. So maybe we want people to put their kitchen scraps in a tote on their counter, but they're going to now have to take that tote and empty it into the larger bin. And then they're going to have to take that bin out to the curb. That's actually the end state behavior. That's the last thing that people do that get you to your outcome. And then third, in listing target behaviors or defining your target behaviors, we need to make sure that we're not listing strategies. So asking people to attend a workshop or visit a website or sign up for a program, those are strategies that you hope will get people to ultimately do it. But by themselves, those things don't impact the outcome. Another consideration when we're selecting behaviors or really thinking about defining our behaviors is this concept of a behavior chain. And this is really pretty new to the literature on community-based social marketing, but has been really, really useful, particularly with programs like composting that are an organics collection that have lots and lots of steps. So essentially, the way we define a behavior chain is what we frequently refer to as a behavior is very often made up of a variety of sub-actions, each of which have their own sets of barriers associated with them. So I'll show you kind of what I mean here. If we just take food scrap collection in a commercial context, let's say a restaurant setting. First, the business owners need to sign up for the collection program. And that might look different depending on where you are, but they're going to need to sign up for collection with the hauler. They're then going to need to get the bins. So that may require researching bins and purchasing bins. You can see there could be different barriers to that. They'll need to identify where to put collection bins. They'll then need to place them. So they might order them, get them, and then just stick them in the storeroom and never actually place them out. So we need to think about every action. They'll then need to train their staff for what items go in, remove any contamination from the plates, scrape the food into the bin, take that bin out to their dumpster or larger collection containers, make sure that's set out for collection, and then clean their bin and bring it back inside. So that's a very simple, I know it could look less complex or more complex depending on where you are, but it's useful to map this out because you can see how there can be different barriers at each one of these steps. So there's barriers just for signing up, there's barriers for training staff, there's barriers at the level of removing contamination at that point that it's going into the bin. So it really helps you to understand the behavior. It can help you to find where your program's running into problems. So if you get lots of people signed up, but nobody's participating, or they're participating, but there's contamination, then it can kind of tell you where to start. And finally, it can help you make the program easier because you can take steps, you can figure out, are there things that we can build into the program that take steps out of the process and just make it easier to participate. So for example, you could, when people sign up, your program delivers the bins, finds the appropriate place for them, places them, and trains staff. That whole chunk could be taken out as an element of a program. So once we have a good understanding of definition of what we're trying to change and how many levels there are, the next step is to get an understanding of the barriers that decrease the likelihood of participation and the benefits that would increase participation. So as I mentioned earlier, barriers can be internal to the individual. That could be elements of the program that make it difficult. So maybe collection isn't frequent enough. Maybe it's something about the bins, a variety of things that people don't have control over. Those are external to the individual. or they can be internal, perception that this is weird, the ick factor, all of those things that are people's, that are under the control of the individual. We also are interested in benefits, but when learning about benefits, it's really important to make the distinction between what would motivate the audience and the purpose of the program. The primary purpose of the program might be landfill space or climate change, but the audience might not be motivated by that. They might be motivated by they get compost that they can use on their property, or eggs. I mean, you went to what Tom mentioned, getting eggs from the chickens. Maybe that's more motivating. So whatever it is that speaks to the audience, that's how we want to be framing the program. So we really want to make sure we get at that. And then the other thing to consider when it comes to barrier and benefit research is that behaviors, I mentioned that barriers are behavior specific, but they can also vary by audience. So younger families might experience different barriers than an older retired couple. Barriers vary by season. I know we don't have a lot of seasons here where Lori and I are. We're in San Diego area in California, but I know you have seasons in Vermont. And barriers could definitely vary based on weather patterns. And then barriers can vary over time. So for example, if new products are coming into the market and people aren't sure where they go, are they compostable or not compostable, new barriers are at play. So to learn about barriers and benefits, we use a number of different elements. We generally start, or always start, very broadly by conducting literature reviews. So this is looking at what other people do or have done nationwide or even globally and what they've run into. So always start there. We may also do observations. So since composting and waste management is generally observable publicly, so looking into the bins to see what people are doing can provide really good information about what people understand about the behavior, what barriers they run into. I remember several years ago now, Lori and I attended a workshop. We helped to facilitate a workshop by Doug McKenzie-Moore, who's the founder of community-based social marketing. And it was up in San Francisco where they were way ahead of the game on collection of organics. And we weren't even doing that down here. Nobody was doing it really, but San Francisco was. And so at the lunch break, they had 3 bins. They had trash, recycling, and compost. And we have a room full of people who are interested in sustainability and behavior change. And people would go to the bins and they knew where to put certain things, but then it would come to like the foil packets for their butter or the napkins. And they were to like start looking into each individual bin to see what other people were doing. And that not only told us, okay, people look to others to decide how to act, which we know, but we could also observe specifically which items people were confused about. So just through some simple observations can give you really good insights to where barriers might come into place. Focus groups as well. And all 3 of those provide a nice foundation to do, if you have the resources, quantitative surveys. So no matter what, I sort of go back to this one here, no matter what, when it comes to audience research, what Lori and I always say is you should never be basing your programs on a hunch about why you think people aren't participating. So with any level of resources, it's important to get outside of the office and get information from the target audience or conduct a few observations, even just a handful of intercept interviews where you go out and you ask people what would make it difficult for you to engage in this behavior and what would you see as beneficial or rewarding about engaging in the behavior. Just those 2 simple questions can give you valuable information about developing your strategy. So that's what I'll talk about next. And unfortunately, with a lot of programs, this is where everybody starts because this is the fun part. This is when you can start being creative and developing taglines and content and websites and all of that. But if you haven't done a good job of thinking through the behaviors and defining them very clearly, and you haven't done any barrier and benefit research, the likelihood that you're going to be able to develop successful strategies is pretty slim. Sometimes you get lucky, but when you go through that data-driven steps, you get lucky much more often. So when we develop strategies, there's 4 things that we consider. First is enhancing motivation. This actually is number 1, because if people are not motivated to do anything at all, they don't see any reason to engage in the program, then the barriers don't matter because they're just not even moving. So motivation, we definitely want to make sure we address, as well as removing any barriers. So one way I like to think about this is thinking about, in this graphic, the wavy lines representing motivation. So where you want to go with your program, whether it's participation or contamination, is the right side of the screen. And so you need some motivation of people moving forward, and then they hit this barrier wall. So one thing you could do here would be to enhance motivation so high that it goes over that barrier wall, or you could reduce barriers so low that their existing level of motivation kind of sails over. But what we like to do is both. So that is, we simultaneously increase motivation while we're bringing down that barrier wall. That's kind of a good way to think about it. The other thing we leverage in our strategies as much as possible is personal contact. We know that mass media, TV, radio, billboards can reach a lot of people. We can just cover everybody with the information. But what we also know is those types of strategies are very weakly associated with behavior change. Whereas one-on-one personal contact, whether that's knocking on doors, neighbor to neighbor, talking with people one-on-one takes a lot longer and you don't reach as many people, but the behavior change associated with that is much greater. So think about maybe the last restaurant you ate at, the last movie that you saw. It's likely that you made that decision not just because you saw the trailer or a billboard, but because you had a one-on-one conversation with someone. That might have been a friend, colleague, it might have been an electronic conversation. I know a lot of our communications happen that way. But that one-on-one personal contact is far more influential when it comes to behavior change than just broad impersonal mass media. And there's sort of a continuum in between. So for example, personalizing your materials to the individual or community that they live in, group discussions or lectures. It could be retail partnerships where they're having a conversation with someone at point of sale. It doesn't necessarily have to mean your program kind of talking to people one-on-one. There's lots of ways to get at that. And we're always trying to leverage personal contact whenever we can. And so then lastly, but not least, we bring in tools from the behavioral and social sciences. And there are lots of them, but I'm just going to talk about a few that we see across most of our programs, particularly in the context of waste and organics. So the first set of tools are focused on removing barriers, and they are education, convenience, and prompts. Now, I said at the beginning that knowledge and awareness is not enough. Not having knowledge can certainly be a barrier. So anytime that people don't know exactly what they should be doing to participate, so what items are accepted or how to participate, definitely we need to include knowledge as part of our strategy. Education is also very appropriate if it is a new program. So say you have a new curbside organics collection program, or if it's a new behavior. And then lastly, if there's a change to the program or behavior, so perhaps accepting a new material or not accepting a material that was previously collected. Those are all times when definitely education is appropriate. So here's just an example of showing people what types of items would be collected in a food scrap and yard debris bin. So the second tool that we use that's focused on removing barriers is convenience. And we're always going to be using this tool as well. Anytime you can make the behavior easier for people to do, you increase the likelihood that people will do it. Humans just naturally are going to choose the path of least resistance. So we always want to make it easy. But what we often don't think of is that we can also facilitate behavior change by making the undesired behavior harder for people to do. So we want to make it harder for them to put organics into the trash. Some of this is, we're seeing this in some institutional settings now with having people go to centralized collection setups, stations, instead of just tossing everything into a desk side. So kind of forcing people to think about their waste and separate. And then another way to address convenience is by reducing the number of steps. And so I addressed that earlier. When you map out a behavior chain, are there elements of the behavior or the process of engaging the behavior that you can kind of take out or simplify to reduce the number of steps that people need to take? So here's just a couple examples. This was some work that Lori and I did here in Oceanside, getting people to pick up after their pets. Sure, we have this catchy message, scoop the poop, it's your duty, but really some of the principal barriers were there weren't enough trash cans and people forgot their bags. So we had to make it more convenient for people to do the right thing, not just motivate them through a clever message. We also know that when it comes to convenience, infrastructure is really important. And so for litter at least, we know that people do not like to go more than 30 feet to a trash can. So having adequate infrastructure for collection of organics, and particularly in public places, is essential. The final tool that we use to address barriers is prompts. And prompts are visual or auditory reminders. And they should really only be used when the primary barrier to engaging in the behavior is that people forget. So if they are getting to the bin and they're forgetting, oh, I don't know what goes where, having a prompt right there to remind people is critical. Prompts are best for repetitive action. So it's things that people are engaging in, and that prompt is intended to remind people of the right action until it becomes their habit. So they're not always going to need to refer to the prompt. They're going to learn over time. Prompts are best when they're placed close in space and time to where the behavior is going to occur. So if we're looking at what goes in particular bins, we're putting the prompts on the bins, not on a refrigerator magnet or a text message or a keychain. So the placement is really important when it comes to prompts. And then lastly, they should emphasize the correct action. So if we tell people what not to do, it doesn't imply that they're going to make the right choice. And often it prompts them to do things that they hadn't even thought of doing. So the prompts should then be positively framed and emphasize real specifically what you want people to do. So here's an example of some work that we did up in Alameda County, which is up in Northern California, where we placed prompts about food scraps that directly onto the kitchen totes about what the types of items that were collected. This was a prompt that was placed on a washing machine to remind people to switch to cold water for washing their clothes. Again, close in space and time to where the behavior would occur. And another way to include prompts is to build it into something that they're doing already. So if they have an existing habit, in this particular case, we were trying to get people to check for broken and misaligned sprinklers. And we knew that they were watering their lawns in the middle of the night. So how do you remind people in the middle of the night? They're probably not gonna be pretty happy with you if you're sending them a text message. So, but we did learn in our audience research is that people were mowing their lawns regularly. So we chose to match our prompts to check their sprinkler systems while they were mowing their lawn. So if there's something in the string of habits that people already do, so they're putting dishes in the dishwasher, for example, how can you build in your organics message or composting message into the string of behaviors they're already doing? So that's something we call habit stacking. We're just kind of building it into their existing script and reminding them. All right, the last three tools I will talk about are three that we use in nearly every campaign at some level, and they're emphasizing enhancing motivation. And we use these because they're really the most powerful tools that we have in our social science toolbox. First is commitment. Commitments are essentially signing a pledge or making a promise that you're going to engage in a particular action. And they're based on the theory of self-perception theory, which was put out there by Daryl Bem. And essentially what it says is that when we do something or when we say we are going to do something, it becomes part of who we are. If we say that we are going to compost, it's because we see ourselves as the kind of person who thinks that is important. Similarly, we like our behaviors and our attitudes to be in line with one another, and consistency is seen as a favorable character trait. So that's really what underlines the efficacy of signing pledges or making commitments. But because they rely on self-perception, we're using these with audiences that are already motivated. We can't coerce people to make a commitment by offering them some sort of prize or reward. They're making the commitment because they see themselves as the kind of person for whom this is important. There have been many studies conducted that have used commitments, and they've looked across all of these studies to try to identify the times at which commitments are most effective. And there are really three critical things to keep in mind when you're using pledges or commitments. First is that they're most effective if they're written, so they're signing something rather than making a verbal commitment. If they're made publicly, so the commitments are posted up on a board where others can see it, because we want to be consistent. And then lastly, durable, that they're long lasting. They're out there for more than just, a one-day event or, on social media where things come and go very quickly. So written, public, and durable commitments are most effective. Here are just a few examples. I know these aren't all specific to waste, but they can be the same types of commitments can be used across all different contexts. This was a commitment that people signed to pledge to turn off their computer and monitor at the end of each workday in a municipal office buildings. And this was about the size of a business card and was placed in the lower left-hand corner of their monitor. So their eyes were drawn to it when they were logging off of their machines. It also had a benefit of seeing multiple commitments around the office of conveying the idea that other people think this is important too. Other people are doing this, which is a social norm that I'll come back to later. We've seen pledges that can be put actually on the green waste bins. So they're putting it out on the bin. It shows to others your commitment, being public. Pledges for used oil filters, that these were signed and placed up at the store and then also placed on a funnel so that they were reminded of their commitment when changing their oil. And then again, signing commitments and posting them publicly clustered together conveys the idea that other people think this is important, and we are very influenced by the behavior and opinions of others. So the last tool, well, what do we do if people, well, actually this isn't the last, the second to last one. So what do we do if something isn't already popular? Like composting or organics collection is pretty new. If you're just now getting policies, there may not be programs yet. So maybe people don't know where they stand on it or aren't necessarily motivated. So when a behavior is new or uncommon, we often use social diffusion. And this is where we're getting someone to model the behavior, who is well known and well respected, and then talk to the others about their participation in the behavior. We see this all the time with technology. If you think about your own social groups, you probably have that one friend, a coworker, family member who's the first one to get the new iPhone or whatever the newest thing is, right? And we kind of like wait for them to do it, have some conversations before now you'll see everybody has one. So same for other behaviors. This technique actually was first used in the 40s with innovative agriculture techniques and continues to be effective in those populations. They work best for behaviors that are visible. So if you have people putting things out at the curb, how do you make that visible and encourage conversation between neighbors or between your models and others? So the best way to do this is to get a commitment from an early adopter, someone who's willing to do it, and then make their commitment public and open the door for conversation. So it might be a yard sign or a sticker that says, hey, I'm doing this, ask me how, and encouraging conversation then. Importantly, the people that you choose to be the model should be both well-known and well-respected. It is possible to be well-known, but not be well-respected. And it's also possible to be well-respected and not be well-known. So the best candidates for our models are those who meet both criteria. And very often we'll find those people through our audience research. This is something Lori and I did. It was a real small community level project that was promoting the use of drip irrigation. And through our audience research, we identified the person in the neighborhood that was everybody knew, and that was the model for having the nicest garden. And so we conducted a demonstration event at her home where she was able to talk to her neighbors about how this was working for her. And then lastly, social norms. As things begin to become more popular, we can definitely leverage social norms. And there are two types of social norms. First is our descriptive social norms, that is information about what other people are doing. And the other is injunctive social norms, and that is what people approve of doing. And they're two different things, because sometimes people think, oh yeah, this is a good idea, but nobody's doing it yet. And sometimes everybody's doing something that is not what's generally approved of. So for example, in a situation, you might have everybody's putting things into the wrong bin, even though we know that most people disapprove of that. Or an area is highly littered, even though we know there's generally social disapproval for littering. So it's really important to remember those distinctions between two types of norms, what people do and what people approve of. What we do know about social norms is that they're very influential. People have a strong desire, whether they admit it or not, and usually not, a strong desire to go with the group, regardless of whether it's the right choice. So because social norms are so influential, they can be used for groups where motivation is low, because people will tend to go with the group, whether they believe it's the right thing to do or not. Because of that, it is also really important to highlight the desired behaviors. We want to be highlighting what do you want people to do, not what is everybody doing that's wrong. So if you have a message that said, everybody's putting plastic in the organics bin, stop, that implies that everybody else is doing the wrong thing, so I might as well too. So a couple of different ways to convey social norms, several different ways. One is to combine commitments together. I've already mentioned that. Another is through text. And so here's an example of both descriptive norms and injunctive norms. So all the way to the right, 82% of Americans report that most or some homes in their neighborhoods set out their recycling for collection. That's highlighting a very positive descriptive norm. Most people do this. And then on the left, 90% of US adults who believe recycling is at least somewhat important and that we should do what we can to recycle. That highlights an injunctive norm. People approve of this. If you don't have a descriptive norm that says people are doing this, you can highlight just the injunctive norm. People approve of this. We can also leverage social norms through normative feedback. That is providing people with information descriptively about what other people are doing. So this example also comes from Alameda County in Northern California, where we provided people with information about the composting rates in neighboring communities. So lastly, no matter what tool you use or how good your research was or how carefully you selected your behavior, if people don't pay attention to the message, none of that's going to matter. So this is where we do still need to leverage good marketing techniques. We want to make sure that the information is captivating and that it resonates with the audience. And there are a few things to keep in mind. There are lots, but these are four really good ones. First, people pay attention to information that is personalized to them. So I already showed you this earlier, but providing, for example, feedback or information that's personalized either to them personally or to their neighborhood locally, that's going to capture attention above and beyond more broadly framed messages. Also using vivid imagery and language. So making concepts tangible, using narratives or vivid language that people can understand. Things like how many tons, that's kind of hard to, unless you're in waste and you know how many tons fit into a collection truck, it's hard to wrap your head around. So making analogies that help people make some of your metrics more tangible can really be useful. So this example just says the amount of waste produced by factory farms is 13 times higher than that of the entire population, which totals to 396 million tons of manure. So it's really hard to say, okay, well, what does that mean? But then they say that is enough to fill the Empire State Building every single day. That is vivid, much more vivid than just saying 396 million tons. We also like to highlight local impacts. So what are the local social, ecological, or economic impacts of the program? People are more likely to pay attention to things that impact them personally rather than globally. And the closer you can get to local impacts, either within their neighborhoods or within the state of Vermont, or even on the eastern United States, the closer you can get to local, the more likely people are to pay attention. And then finally, making sure, I've said this before, that we're focusing on what is important for the audience. And so I like to point out and just remind us that the reason for delivering the program doesn't always align with the audience's reason for engaging in the behavior. So this example I have here was a program that we did to get people to pick up after their pets on large rural properties. And these are unincorporated areas of San Diego County where people aren't really connected to the ocean. So they're not picking up for water quality, but they wanted to be able to use their yards and for barbecues and having people over, and they didn't want to step in it. So we're speaking to people in those terms rather than simply the water quality protection message. That was sub to the primary message. So a lot of different ways we can go with the strategies, leveraging these different tools. And all of these tools have been demonstrated to work in various contexts. But we really want to make sure before we're spending all of our dollars on delivering programs that they work on a small scale and that they're cost effective. So that's what we do with pilot testing. This allows us to identify and address any problems. So maybe people are starting to use plastic bags. We can address that through the messaging. Maybe they misunderstand some message. There's a lot of things that we can address through doing that pilot, any unanticipated problems that come up. It also allows us to test different variations of the program. Lori's working on a program right now up in Central California, where we're able to test variations of a organics collection program with providing them with a kitchen tote, with providing a kitchen tote for them to come pick up, or not providing them a tote at all. And the reason we're testing those different variations is that each of those variations of the program have a different cost associated with them. So we're not just interested in did behavior change, but what is the cost per behavior change? And that provides us really important information about return on investment that can inform our ability to scale up. So if you get, say, a 15% increase in participation, if you give people a pail, but you get only let's say you get a 12% change if they come pick up a pail, well, you're probably going to go with the 12% because you're distributing less pails. So that's going to be a less expensive program, which is actually not what we found in that one. But the point is, it gives you really good information about the cost of expanding the program. Now, pilot testing does add some time to program development, but it has a much long-term return and cost savings because you're delivering the most cost-effective program possible. If you don't need to give people bins, if it's just as effective if they come pick them up, then that's a really important kind of cost distinction between two versions of the program. So here's what it kind of look like. You would do some pre-test measurements, whether you're actually doing just lid flips or you're doing full waste characterizations. And then you could test different strategies in different areas. And then we usually maintain a control group that doesn't get the strategy at all. And then follow-up measurements. And so that allows us to be confident that it was our strategy or one of those strategies that changed the behavior above and beyond what would have just happened under normal circumstances. So here's another example of that work that we did in Alameda County, where there were 4 different groups. There was a control group, and then there was a group that just got countertop pails. There was a group that got hang tags on their collection bins, and there was a group that got those feedback reports. And so all 3 strategies were effective above and beyond the control group, and to different degrees, but about equally effective. And so that really informed, when they're looking at the cost of delivering the program, which way to move forward. So pilot testing allows us to go back and refine our strategy and then repilot test it until we know it's effective. There's also another feedback loop built in that barrier and benefit research. So if you find out, oh, these barriers are too great for us to address with our program, you might go back and refine the ask and pick a different behavior. That's a great thing about community-based social marketing, is that data and feedback loop is built into the process. So lastly, before we move to questions, I just wanted to leave up some additional resources. This has just been a real quick overview of the process that we use, but there are many, many case studies out there on those websites. There are courses and trainings available, as well as books that dive deeper into different elements of this kind of work. So I know Lori's been answering some questions in chat, but I wanted to open it up to some more broad questions and invite Lori to weigh in and talk about some of the programs that she's working on here in California.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. This was great information. Lori, do you want to jump in? I've been following chat too, but you may be more tuned to where you want to lead us.
Yes, actually, Tom had a really good question about the threshold for presenting social norms. So how many people have to be participating for you to really kind of highlight and then influence others. So I did kind of refer that question to Jennifer because she's absolutely up on the latest and greatest with social norms. But what I did say was we are really careful about the way that we apply social norms in our messaging, because you can end up with unintended consequences. So we do typically look at, are a good, a fair, like majority of people participating in the behavior, or is it a behavior where you really need to be highlighting that a slim majority, is that okay? Or do you really need a more overwhelming majority to be engaging or to have that attitude in order to highlight that? So it kind of depends on the behavior. With a new program or a new behavior, we're looking at providing information about growth of the norms. So the fact that right now this many people are engaging in it, but that number is going to grow. So Jennifer can really probably provide you with a little bit more precision on that. But yeah, I can follow up too with more on what we tested in the food scraps program that Jennifer. So I would go ahead with your social norms, Jennifer, and then I'll talk about the pilot.
You pretty much hit on it, Lori. There isn't an exact number. So it's not that, it's you have to hit 75 or you have to hit 50. It really does vary. There is new research, and this is really new research, like the last couple of years coming out on what Lori alluded to, which are dynamic norms. And that is, it appears that people are motivated by evidence that the norm is growing. So growing numbers of people are doing this thing, that appears to be motivating, particularly for things that are generally new, where you don't have a norm yet. More importantly, with norms than the numbers are the referent groups. So it's really important to make sure that the norm you're providing is not an out group. So in Vermont, you wouldn't want to be saying that, 80% of people in California do this, because they're going to be like, well, that's California, or if you have different parts of the state that have different attitudes and beliefs or different segments, you really want to make sure that the norm you're communicating is as similar as possible to the audience that you're trying to affect. So people in your neighborhood is something that we very often use, or people in your city, rather, that is more impactful than what people across even the state are doing. So just a couple of nuances to keep in mind when it comes to social norms. And I know there are questions about the pilot too, so I wanted to let Lori talk about that.
Yes, so we tested 3 different conditions, and this is a new program being launched. Well, it's a statewide program. The legislation became effective January, and that is to that all residents and businesses have to do something with their food scraps besides putting them in the trash. And the jurisdictions and haulers came up with, different strategies, different ways of ensuring that food scraps aren't going into the trash. So it could be that some communities have a split cart where there's trash on one side and food scraps go alone on the other side, where other communities have green waste bins and the jurisdictions want the food waste in with the landscape material. Or in the case that particular week, you don't have any landscape material in your green cart, they still want those food scraps in there. So we're working with a group, an agency in the central coast of California on helping them help the jurisdictions in the region to get their food scraps collection moving. And in this case, the food scraps are going to a facility where they would be turned into compost. And that compost would be available to local farms as well as to the community. And so we tested 3 different conditions. In all of the conditions, the neighborhoods received an educational flyer, and that then told them how to participate. Because again, this is new. So it told them, what they needed to do to participate. 3 simple steps. Told them please don't put these things in there. So then in the first condition, they got the educational flyer and we gave them a kitchen pail. And that was delivered to the doorstep. In the second condition, they received the flyer in the mail with a cover letter that had a voucher on it that said, go get this kitchen pail at City Hall. And then in the third condition, which we called the education only control, they were mailed the flyer, but did not receive the voucher for the kitchen pail, to pick up the kitchen pail. And so what we found was and then we followed up a few weeks later with lid flips. So we had a team that went out and opened up the trash, the recycling, and the green waste cart and looked for food, the presence or absence of food in each of those carts. And what we found was that the group that had the informational flyer and the kitchen pail delivered to their doorstep, their participation rate was double that of the other 2 groups. So those who actually even went and got the voucher, they participated at about the same rate as the education only group. However, there was a caveat. And that is, of those who did go pick up so there were people in the voucher group that did not go pick up a kitchen pail, but they participated. But of those who picked up a kitchen pail, they actually participated at a rate that was slightly higher than the delivery group. So there is some nuance there. We wish we had a larger sample size because we really think that pickup group probably is going to be pretty powerful. But anyway, so that's kind of how it all ended up. It was really interesting
thing. And we're still reporting this, which is why we did it.
Yeah.
I don't have any figures and stuff I could share with you today, but the interesting thing that it seems to be there's something about having that kitchen tote. Now, whether it is that reciprocity, which I kind of see mentioned in the chat, like, oh, okay, they gave me this thing, so I feel inclined to participate. Or we've hypothesized it could just be that having that physical thing on your counter serves as a prompt by itself, reminding you to participate. So we're not really sure the mechanisms, but the data does seem to suggest, or pretty strongly suggest, that there's something about having a pail that increases participation. So
Yeah, and there was nothing cute about the pail. So the cuteness factor was non-existent. It was just the plain old pail. We did do some work on the print, the stamp that went on it, to figure out what needed to go on that, because, and also it was very heavily Spanish speaking area of California. So, having 2 languages on the pail was going to be challenging. So we did do an experiment to kind of figure out what they needed to be on the pail too, which was pretty interesting. But it was not cute.
Yeah, and Tom just added in, there may be something to having people take some effort in going to get their pail. So having a higher level of personal investment in the activity or behavior.
Yeah.
As well.
Exactly. And that's where we had really, we just ended up with a smaller sample size than we had hoped, but we really do think there is something there. Exactly. Had we had a larger sample size, we think there was likely a link between that. Absolutely.
And it aligns with research on effort justification. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the IKEA effect. So we value things more that we've put time into. And that's also kind of what underlies why written commitments are more effective than verbal commitments, because you've been actively involved. So however little time that is, there's something about writing out a commitment that is enough active involvement in it that it enhances that self-perception. Well, I wouldn't write this out or spend this much time if I wasn't the type of person who believed this to be important. So there's kind of 2 different mechanisms at play there, but I definitely think that there could be a role. So,
yeah, I think in the state of Vermont, one of the things that I hear very often at the Composting Association is from a lot of residents who are trying to do the right thing, but are confused and inconsistency in messaging or changes. This had come up in a previous session yesterday about compostable packaging and all of the sort of look-alike products out there. And you're like, I don't know which it is. I don't know what to buy, or I don't know what to do with it once I get it in my house. But I think that, really engaging with some of the solid waste management entity folks in our state, because that's kind of how it's divided up in different facilities with different rules or in these different districts. And some of you folks are in the participant are participating today. And so if you want to chime in, please do. But I think this might be some, hopefully some energizing ideas to get, to do some specific work at that district level, as opposed to, there needs to be consistency in some messaging statewide, but it is true that different compost facilities take different things, and different haulers in different parts of the state have different rules of what they take or what they don't take. And so, I think there's a statewide piece, but I also really heard what you both said about it being, maybe in your own neighborhood, your own town, or your own, solid waste district, to help tie that together and have it make a little bit more sense or be more cohesive.
Yeah, I agree. We see that, and Lori may want to add some things. So I definitely think that more broad level, having those discussions, but then a couple of things that we've done kind of at the level of the consumer. First is in our messaging, really focusing on those items that people are confused about. Instead of throwing all the items on there, get some data as what are those items that are causing confusion, and use that real estate that you have on your outreach pieces for those things that are most meaningful. Lori did some work in commercial buildings pertaining to regular recycling, where on the communication materials, it included only photos of the things that people typically brought to the office. So, in that way, it's personally relevant as well. And then the other thing is the idea of habit discontinuity. So that is placing messages and timing messages when they're moving to different places. So if they've been accustomed to doing something another way, and now they start a new job in a different jurisdiction, or they move, to the next city over and the rules are completely different, making sure that they're getting the information and the outreach at that time where their habits are already kind of disrupted, that's when they're going to be most susceptible to, or most influenced to make a change. So a couple of ways that we can address it. It doesn't fix it. It's still very confusing, but it does help. I don't know, Lori, if you have anything else you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's to put ourselves in the place of the residents who may be getting, you know, information from haulers or the jurisdiction or these, you know, the larger agencies, even at the state level. You know, it can absolutely be confusing. And one of the things that we did that was focused on getting the right things in and the wrong things out was that we found that for the pail to use there's not much space on a pail to communicate what goes in and what should not be in there. And so for the what goes in, we did an experiment to find, because the client was really wanted to use icons and not words. And the words did need to be in English and Spanish. So we did an experiment to figure out how many icons you needed to include to get people to understand that it's fruits, it's vegetables, you know, dairy and whatever. So we found that you don't need to use very many. I use 2 icons to represent a group. The problem is, don't put the apple here and then a chicken here and then a banana here, and, you know, cluster the like items so that their brains process that right away. Oh, that's fruit. Oh, that's, you know, the dairy items, that's meat. So that was one thing, but also the things that could not go in were so disparate. There wasn't a way to represent everything in icons and even do some grouping so that they could understand, because it was the variety was really wide. So we focused in on those few items that they had some information that people already put in the green waste that don't belong in there. And we used words and translated them in English and Spanish. So yeah, another demonstration of trying to reduce the confusion for residents.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience? From the participants? Feel free to either raise your hand in chat and you can unmute, or type it into chat. And just while folks are maybe thinking about that, I'll just add that it's, you know, when you go to those bins, like that bank of bins, I mean, even, you know, we used to do before the pandemic, and we would do the summit in person, we would have, you know, the compost, the recycle, and the trash. And we always had to have volunteers standing there, because even a group of folks who think about this, engage in it, are better educated than sort of probably the broader population in Vermont, would still be like standing there trying to figure out where things went if we didn't have all the signs right and all of the, you know, or, you know, you're in the middle of a conversation and you're not paying it, you know, like there's all of these different things. And how do you have the cues show up at the right time for places? Or at the University of Vermont, in one building, the signs look one way, and in another building, they look a different way. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been at a conference there, and I mean, I stand there and I'm like, I don't know where to put the stuff that's in my hands. Where does it go? And so it is just sort of addressing some of those issues. Yeah. Lowering those barriers of just the confusion. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Well, I'm not seeing more questions here. We're just about out of time as well. So I'm actually just going to invite you, Jennifer, to stop sharing your screen. And I'm going to just put up my closing slides here. The 3 p.m. session is Financing Your Compost Business, Alternatives and Best Practices. That's with Linda from the U.S. Composting Council. So thanks again so much to Jennifer and Lori for joining us today and for sharing all that you know about the behavioral science piece of this. I look forward to staying in touch. Maybe if we run some experiments here, we'll get some data to you based on your process. And and thanks so much to our participants as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all your time and great questions. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, good luck with your programs. Thank
Great.
you.